Okay, let's get started. I'm Stuart Staniford with FireEye, and we're a vendor that makes advanced malware detection gear that detects advanced malware and a particular focus on drive-by downloads, also malware callbacks in the network. And I'm going to give you a flavor of some of what we're seeing in the last 6 months or so. And the talk's going to have a few different parts. I'm going to start by telling you a tiny bit about our product, just enough that you'll understand the rest of the talk. It's obviously not mainly a marketing presentation. And then I'm going to sort of give you some overview statistics of the shape and size of the threat. And then finally, I'm going to take you through in very low-level, gory detail, one, and depending on how time goes, maybe two, specific drive-by events that are from the last 10 days or so, and just look at what's currently happening on the wire. So this is just the problem overview slide that large brands are getting compromised and reported in the news, and we have found from experience that sometimes when we mention specific company names, people get their feelings hurt, so they're all blanked out on the slide. But so the question becomes, if you end up in the headlines like that, is it because you did something bad and you have sloppy security, or is it were you just unlucky? Everybody has problems, and it's just a matter of which of the news the lions happen to pick on in the herd. The answer turns out to be a bit of both, and this is from a survey that I did of a few hundred enterprises in mostly North America, but a little bit global, where we have a device installed. And I was just looking at the aggregate number of infected clients that we see, as measured by an IP address that either issues a known malware callback, or where we see an infection event go to it, or we see it download a malicious binary. And so it's a reasonably large and hopefully somewhat representative sample. And what we find is, and I've normalized it where my unit of measure here is how many infected IPs you see in a week in 1 gig of traffic, because obviously enterprises are all different sizes and have all different amounts of traffic, and a small enterprise, other things being equal, will have fewer events than a large enterprise. And so I just sort of, if you had 50 meg, I would multiply you up by 20 to get to 1 gig. And if you had 2 gig, I would divide you by 2. And then here I'm plotting essentially the probability distribution. What fraction of deployments do we see at least this many? So here at 100, we're up at, give or take, 80%, have at least that many infections per week per gig, right? So the median is, I forget the exact number, but it's something like 350, a few hundred infected machines knocked over in a gig of traffic. Now, obviously, a gig is a decent-sized enterprise, typically. So you're seeing sizable rates. Now, really good enterprises on the low end, you might be down to 10 IPs knocked over per week in a gig of traffic. And that's typically an environment where you see a lot of patching, very up-to-date machines, perhaps a VDM architecture where everybody is on Windows 7 with all service packs installed, blah, 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 and all the clients are up to date. There are a few of those environments, and many people are not in that situation. Very strict proxy policies, that kind of stuff, where if the URL filter list doesn't know this domain, then you're not allowed to go to it. That kind of measure, and no executables in the clear on the wire. And then of course you get unfortunate places where the events rates are really high. And that tends to be the scenario where we go into a small shop that already has a lot of infections. And so then when you multiply up a small bandwidth by whatever it takes to get to 1 gig, you get huge numbers. So we're seeing an awful lot of malware out there on networks everywhere. But there's huge variation in the rate. Everybody seems to have some. And I want to give you a little bit of a flavor of how we detect this stuff so that you can sort of understand the context. And so we basically have a product that, maybe I'll back up and just say a little bit about the company history. We started in 2004. And at that time, there was, it was sort of the worm era. We had Slammer and Blaster and so forth running around. And the initial concept for the company was as a zero-day worm detection company. And the idea was that the worms would go on and get worse, and they would be using zero-day exploits, and how could you detect that with signature-based technology? And the concept was, well, we'll look for port scans, and then we'll try to get the port scanning thing to talk to it. We'll stand up a virtual machine with a copy of Windows and a copy of vulnerable services, and we'll get the port scanning thing to talk to that. We'll replay the traffic, and we'll see if we can get that traffic to infect this virtual machine. And that worked technologically, but not as a business, because all the worms sort of disappeared around the 2005, 2006 timeframe. And I became involved in FireEye, having had a background in research in computer anomaly detection. I became involved and helped them transition to a web-based product. So basically it became about, we watch all the stuff coming back off HTTP, and we look for, let's say, obfuscated JavaScript. So you see, and I'll flash some up later, you see some JavaScript that doesn't look like any reasonable programmer would have created this JavaScript, because it's gone through some convoluted set of packers and transformations that have turned it into something ugly looking that a human can't read and wouldn't have written. And so it's not straightforward to see what that means, but we'll basically fire up the virtual machine now with a browser inside it and have that browser go and get that piece of obfuscated JavaScript and see what happens. And we'll discover, so the browser will go just like a browser would on the end client. The browser in the virtual machine will go and get this obfuscated JavaScript and de-obfuscate it just like any browser would, do what it does. And maybe it's going to go out and get something else, let's say a malicious PDF or a flash file or a Java archive library, and download that and execute that too. And then we've got these virtual machines instrumented. So this part of the picture sort of depicting a stack of virtual machines. Depending on our appliance model, we might have 2, 32, 64. We have a whole range of virtual machines that we're running in parallel. So, and they're all instrumented so that we can say stuff like, let's say you download a page off the web that you've just seen go by on the wire, and you discover that the result of loading that into the browser is that a new file is downloaded and executed as an executable, as a binary on the system. Okay, that's something that an unattended virtual machine should never do. It just shouldn't happen. And if it does happen, it's an absolute surefire indication that there was some kind of exploit or compromise. Similarly, we have instrumentation at the CPU level. So we can look for stuff like this virtual machine, the program counter in the CPU, right now is executing in a region of memory that we know we loaded from a web page, right? So somehow the actual program counter is executing binary instructions that we know for sure, because we're tracking where everything goes in memory in our instrumented virtual machine, we know for sure came from a web page. And that's not something that should ever happen. The browser should be executing its own code that it loaded off disk. It should not be executing the contents of web pages. And if that ever happens, it's guaranteed for sure bad. And those kinds of mechanisms don't depend on knowing anything specific about the exploit. We don't have to know exactly where in the binary, where in the browser the problem is. We don't have to know what the web page specifically looked like. We're not looking for particular sequences of bytes, at least not in this VM confirmation. Instead, we just notice that, hey, run this thing in a virtual machine in a browser, bad stuff happens that shouldn't ever happen, and therefore it must be an exploit. So it's a true zero-day technology in that sense. So the part that I've added to it and mostly worked on is in the front end. So what happens is when you replay a browser session in a virtual machine, it takes 45 seconds or a minute or two, whatever, to fire up the virtual machine, load stuff into the browser, see what it does for a while, watch its, we'll often let it run for a bit and see, okay, first it exploits the browser, then it runs this binary, then the binary tries to go back and talk to this network. So we're running, 64, a few tens, shortly we'll have models with hundreds of virtual machines. But in the meantime, we're watching a gig of traffic, let's say, on the front end of the appliance. So we've got, maybe 150,000 packets per second coming down. So there's a huge impedance match between what's on the wire out here coming in and how many things we can actually run in a virtual machine, given we're running, let's say 32 of them on one model. And a run might take on average a minute. So what we have to do is we have a bunch of statistical heuristics in here that basically try to capture anything that's a little bit weird, right? So we have all kinds of algorithms and statistics that are looking for stuff like this JavaScript is obfuscated, this PDF contains a large object that we can't parse, this flash file uses some unusual features that are correlated with malware. And all of these kinds of statistical heuristics are in themselves fairly unreliable in that they have a lot of false positives. For example, obfuscated JavaScript. There are many innocent reasons to obfuscate your JavaScript. You'll see people put out libraries that they've obfuscated just in order to protect their intellectual property, that they don't want somebody else to be able to reverse engineer their JavaScript and reuse it, right? And so obfuscated JavaScript in and of itself is not proof positive of a bad thing happening. But it does mean that, until you execute that JavaScript, there's no way to know whether it's good or bad, right? So in this phase, we'll be firing all kinds of obfuscated JavaScript over, for example, and all kinds of PDFs and flash files and so forth. And then seeing what happens in the virtual machine, and that's how we're separating the sheep from the goats. Typically, this thing is deployed in kind of near the egress of the network. So out here's the internet, egress router, firewall, maybe not an IPS, almost always a web proxy, which almost always has AV that's inspecting at least some things, and almost always has URL blocking of some form. And then you have an internal network, and then users who, of course, have some AV on their desktop in just about every corporate customer I've ever seen. And so we're going in after all this stuff, right? And so the stats and stuff I'm presenting to you, and in general, probably my whole worldview, are shaped by not knowing about what bounces off the back of here, right? The web proxy undoubtedly stops some things. The firewall stops sort of old port scanning type threats. The desktop AV undoubtedly works on a certain fraction of binaries. But the stuff that's left over is still this, right? When we go in and do proof of concept demonstrations, we find hundreds of infected IPs per week in a gig of traffic. And there are basically two major flavors of things of how stuff is getting in. Maybe three major flavors. The two high volume ones are both web driven and are drive-by exploits, where you're going to a web page, and I'll take you through a particular sequence. You get a malicious ad, it's going to exploit your browser, download some stuff, and there's no user involvement. And then the other sort of major flavor is social engineering attacks. So this is, you go to some web page, it pops up, it has some JavaScript that pops up a a panel that says your system is infected with malware, you should really install our free AV, and the user agrees to do that, and actually there was no malware ahead of time, but now there is because the fake AV software is malware. Well, the other favorite one is, you know, a user is browsing the internet looking at, let's say, interesting looking videos of one flavor or another, and you know, they click on a video that they desire to watch that's somehow enticing, and it pops up and says, oh, you need this new codec, or your Flash is out of date, you need to install Flash. Here, let us help you, here's the Flash file you need, right? So the user, thinking they're installing a new version of Flash, is in fact installing a piece of malware. And then the third most common way is the sort of lower volume one, is kind of the email-driven thing, where you have more of a spearphishing type scenario, where a user is being sent either a link or an attachment. You know, hey, look at this PDF, here's this report from, you know, your colleague at a different organization, you really ought to open it up, or here's this link, check this out, which in turn goes to a drive-by download. So, to give you more of a way of thinking about how to break the problem down, this is a chart that shows, and again, I'm working off this same sample of a few hundred enterprises, and so it covers basically, I think, about the current version, about 500,000 infected end clients that I am surveying and characterizing, and across all those enterprises. And this is showing, in many cases, we are able to put a name on the infection. So we see all these different threats. We allow them to run in our virtual machine, and we see binaries pop out, which you can then run on VirusTotal and see, well, what does anyone else call them? We see the thing make attempts at network communication that we know that our unattended virtual machine should not make. And so we say, well, where was it trying to talk to? You know, oh, look, it was going to this domain over here, and we know that's associated with this campaign. Or it uses a particular form of URL that we know is associated with SpyEye, let's say. Or it uses, you know, it sends out, in its command and control communication, it sends out an HTTP request, and the header is weird. It has the headers in a different order than browsers usually do. And so we can pick up on this quirk in their programming and say, oh, that's this particular threat, right? So we have a few thousand names that we can associate with particular malware, as opposed to just saying, hey, something happened to your virtual machine and it was bad. In some cases, we could say, oh, and it was this particular thing. And so what I did was to rank all those, which are the most common, right? The first, second, out to the 50th, 100th, 300th most common piece of malware. And then I looked at what fraction of all the events are explained by, let's say, the first 10, the first 25, the first 50. Okay, so round about, you know, these different colors of the different quarters of 2011, round about 75% are explained by the first 50. And we can put a label in the top 50 pieces of malware. Okay. And then this goes out to 100, is, you know, not a little shy of 90%, and you're up to about 96, 97, 98, depending on the quarter, at 300. And this keeps going, you know, out into the thousands, but wouldn't fit on the slide. And so the way I think about this is you've kind of, well, a couple of points to make about it. One is, I think it's kind of interesting from the standpoint of, you know, you'll hear the AV companies talk about, we see 90,000 MD5s a day, you know, or however many gazillion a year, right? And the number has gone up X 100% from last year, right? So the number of seeming threats on the wire is sort of going nuts. But I don't think that's because there are millions of different hackers with millions of different tools out there. I think instead there's thousands. You know, if you think of an individual guy or a team of guys, you know, or perhaps they're women too, who are developing a particular piece of malware, they have their source code tree, and they push out, you know, versions of their malware, and every so often they keep modifying it and improving it, right, as they pursue their ill-gotten gains in whatever way they're doing it. So how many of these malware code bases are out there? So my estimate, I mean, I'm not going to be precise here, but my estimate is that's thousands, right? It's not millions, but it's not hundreds either. And then, and of all that stuff, you've got this high volume stuff that's explaining most of the events, the first few dozen families. And then you've got a long tail of rare malware that you don't see that often. And what distinguishes the common malware is its high degree of dynamism, right? Because again, this is all stuff that's getting past the existing defenses, right? So this is something that somehow knows how to get past the blue coat / Symantec / Juniper / whatever typical security stack. And so the stuff that's at the front of this curve, the common families, is doing that in volume day after day. Whereas the stuff that's out here, is maybe only having to do it occasionally. And so the stuff that does it in volume day after day, how is it doing it? Well, it's doing it by being highly dynamic. And to give you one flavor, I'm going to cover this from a couple of different angles. This shows just the top threats on any given day for the first half of 2011. And, I'm not going to try and make a point about the exact 15 threats that were top. But my point is this is incredibly spiky, right? One day, suddenly, you'll see 10% almost of events are associated with one given particular threat, and then the next day it's almost disappeared into the noise, right? And some other thing will be spiking up. And so what you're generally seeing is, these guys are operating in a campaign mode where they are pushing out a particular version of their toolkit, their particular exploit kit, their particular binary. They're pushing that out, they're pumping on it for a day, for 8 hours, for whatever it is. They're capturing a bunch of systems. And then they go off into a cycle and they monetize for a bit over whatever they've got. They change around key aspects of the system so it looks a bit different, and then they rinse and repeat, go and do another campaign. But the MD5s now are going to look a bit different. The malicious domains they're using are going to look different. And so the stuff that the various defenses are trying to pick up on, oh, I know you're a suspicious URL, I'm going to block you. Or I recognize this particular binary, I'm going to block it. That's now ineffective because they've just mutated everything. And if you look in particular, if we look at all the drive-bys we detect, where did they come from? What was the domain name that had the malicious thing on, right? So if I take that across all these few 100,000 infections and I ask, when did I first see this particular malicious domain and when did I last see it, right? That's sort of the lifetime of the domain. Maybe I saw it for an 8-hour period. Maybe I saw it for 3 days. A few of them go on for weeks and weeks. So then this is the curve, right, of that observed lifetime. And this is 7 days, 14 days, 2 weeks, out to, I guess this is, 8 weeks, if I remember my times tables. And then this is what fraction of the domains last at least that long. Right, so you can see 80–90% of malicious domains are very short-lived. We only see them for, an hour or two, or even just once. And then there's you can see next, these steps, the sort of crinkled step-like appearance, that's on a daily thing, right? So this first step is the guys that rotate their domain on a 24-hour schedule. And then the second step is a residual number that rotate every 48 hours, and so on. And you go out, and then this is the small number of domains that are sort of long-lived, malicious domains that are long-lived. Because obviously from the standpoint of the bad guys, a long-lived malicious domain is going to end up on all the URL blacklists after a while and become increasingly ineffectual, right? So they have an incentive to keep rotating them. And to a significant degree, they're very good at that, and a lot of them are rotating them very fast, as in much less than a day. Similarly, with the MD5s of particular binaries. So we pluck all the binaries that we see in the clear off the wire and throw them in a virtual machine just to see what they do and if you just launch them from the command line. And we have a bunch of ways of deciding that that MD5 is behaving badly, that particular binary. Similarly, the binaries that we see pop out when we detect a web exploit, maybe there was no binary on the wire, but out it pops in the middle of the virtual machine, and so then we'll look at that, right? And so if you do the same thing where you say, well, the first time I saw this MD5 was at 3 o'clock on Friday, and the last time I saw it was at 7 o'clock on Saturday, and so that one lasted for 28 hours, right? And then again, you plot, well, what fraction of them are, here I guess I just went to 6 weeks, and you see again the vast bulk are very short-lived. And again, you get a pulse of 24 hours, 48 hours, and so on, of these guys that are rotating on, I generated a newly packed binary. I'm going to use it for 24 hours, and then I'm going to recycle it, right? And obviously, this is presumably automated because you get this fairly sharp pulse, around the 24-hour thing. Or maybe it's guys that just come in every morning and fire up a new binary and send it off. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is go in to an actual drive-by exploit. Because I get to spend a lot of my days stirring at nasty stuff that goes past on the wire of various research partners that we have. We have a relationship with a number of mainly university, but some commercial customers where we actually have access to the box, and so I get to look at that and see what stuff is going on, and make sure that we're picking up on everything, and if we have a false positive, deal with that. So I stirred this stuff a lot, and so this event is from I believe March 12th. And what I'm showing you here, this is going to be very low level, so I hope you're up for that. It was advertised as such in the talk description. So what you're staring at here is, this is a table of all the flows, all the for tuples that a particular individual who was surfing at a university, and you can see that some of these domain names are maybe not too savory. You can sort of, I'm going to guess that this individual was a he. And so he's surfing porn, and so you see these sort of various porn-looking type domains, and things start to go wrong down here in this ABG blah blah domain, and then this ACC domain. And I'm going to dive in and show you this one first, right? So this is everything that was on that particular flow, and it was an HTML, and it looked like this. And so you can see this is sort of some kind of applet here, and then we've got a script here. So this is some JavaScript, and it's nasty-looking JavaScript, right? With no proper variable names. You can't tell what anything is, right? And then somewhere down in here, there's going to be an eval or something, and I won't try and oh yeah, here we go. And so this whole thing is going to transform itself into something that we don't quite know what it is. And from having studied a lot of these, I'm sort of aware that this is an instance of the black hole exploit kit, which is currently in one of the popular exploit kits that are being used by a variety of bad guys for a variety of different purposes. And so this is malicious HTML on this particular flow. And then I'm going to work sort of forwards and backwards from that. How did this user end up on that malicious HTML, and what did it do? And so let's first work forwards. And on the what did it do part. So this flow here, this flow number 21, was the malicious HTML. And flow number 22 here was a 12 kilobyte jar, gplugin.jar there, okay? And So this ran in our virtual machine, and I have a screenshot, if I can find the right one, okay, so this is a screenshot. This is actually, this page, unlike everything else I'm showing you, is from the GUI of our product. And this shows the things that were done in the virtual machine when this malicious HTML followed by this jar executed in the virtual machine. And the giveaway bad thing is you can see that down here, this is process started, and started something from a temp directory, update a local temp, and then this long numeric name for .exe, and it was started by the Java exe, right? So Java somehow started up in an unattended virtual machine with no user. Java started up an exe with a weird name that we've never seen before. Okay, bingo, this is bad. And and in particular, however, in particular, this binary was well known to be bad when I uploaded it. Yeah, this is the one. When I uploaded the binary to Various Total, 30 out of 43. Okay, so most AVs at the time that this was going across the wire recognized this, with a caveat that it didn't go across the wire in the clear. It went across the wire inside this jar. And this is what we're seeing more and more now. That you used to see, you'd see malicious HTML, malicious PDF, whatever, and then you'd see EXEs coming across in the clear. So you'd see, an HTTP request, you'd see a response with an application/octet stream type, content type, and you'd see, MZ, and then you'd see, this program cannot be run in the DOS environment, blah, blah. It would look like a Windows PE header. But now, I would say, I haven't done exact stats recently, but I would say something like 2/3 to 3/4 of events that we see on the wire, you see a jar. And inside the jar, and so jar is basically a variant of the zip archive format. And it's sort of a container thing that Java uses to store classes and Java code in. But you can also stick just arbitrary objects in it that the Java is then going to access. So you can put an exe in there, the Java is going to pull it out, can transform it in whatever form, right? Because you're running inside Java at this point, so you've got a programming language. So the exe can be encrypted or transformed in any way they like inside the jar. And then they're going to pull it out at runtime, and then it's going to pop up on the end client. But it's hard to find in transit, right? So it's basically a strategy for... So this is a strategy for avoiding gateway AV. Right, the gateway AV is going to sit there and look at pull all the EXEs off inside a Blue Coat proxy or whatever, shove them through to an AV that's going to run on them all and say, oh, this is a bad EXE, right? And so these guys are sticking them inside jars, obfuscated in an attempt to avoid that happening. And so this is a bad EXE inside a jar. And so that's, bad things have happened to the end client, probably. And so how did this happen? How do we get here? So if I can find the right piece here. Yeah, this is the one. Well, we were browsing porn, and we came across a malicious ad like this. This is a... Again, this flow here is the malicious domain. This is the this was the bad HTML. This is the lead-in domain, and basically this was a malicious ad. So the ad popped up a picture advertising that maybe you need help with your performance, and but in the meantime, it also included a little piece that went and got a little tiny iframe that went and got the malicious exploit. And now I looked up, I went further back in here, and I discovered that this this flow, so these are the two obviously malicious domains. They have weird names, and when you look them up, they're known bad domains. These guys, so this is flow number 17. And you can see these. This is the source port here. This is the 5-tuple. I've rewritten the PCAP so that the source IP is 127.0.0.2 to for privacy reasons. And similarly, I've rewritten all the destinations, but the source port was a slightly lower one, so this is earlier in the sequence. And this thing, this Imedia.com. So I went and looked up their website, and that is, I think, this one. Yeah, Imediacom. So this, we see this on the wire. It's some kind of ad thing. But when you go to their website, it says, "Sorry for the mess. Our site is being redesigned." Right. So this is an outfit that's a little bit flaky. The website's not up right now, and they can't spell, or they can't use proper grammar anyway. And so this thing, if you look inside, and here I'm going to look inside the actual packet. So this is an HTTP response from this ad server, and it said HTTP 11.302 found. So this is a redirect. This is basically a response from an HTTP server saying, "Hey, I don't have it. Go look over here." And location where you're to go look is HTTP blah blah ABJ HHJ. Okay, so this dubious looking ad company is redirecting you into the exploit domain. And where did they come from? Well, I tracked it down the other night when I was doing this, and I momentarily have lost it. But the previous ad domain, it was like a chain of ad domains, and the previous one was these guys, ad expansion. So there was basically, these guys had sold a banner ad to the porn site. And these are somewhat more legitimate looking. I mean, it's still porn advertising, but this is, at least their website's up, and they appear to be selling adult traffic. They'd shown it, they'd sold that on to Imediacom, and they in turn, obviously had some kind of relationship with the true bad guys and had redirected to an actual exploit server, right? So this case is porn. It's not always porn. Malicious advertising is one of the most common forms of lead-in to drive-by download. Usually it's some mixture of malicious ads where you go through some chain of redirects. And redirection is very common in the ad industry generally, even in the perfectly legitimate ad industry. It's very common to see chains of reselling that then become on the wire chains of redirects as it goes from one domain to another. But then sometimes you end up in shifty parts of the ad infrastructure, and certainly the adult sites are often shifty, but it can also happen on legitimate sites. And the other major way is compromised sites. So a legitimate web site of some form gets compromised, let's say by an SQL injection attack or something of the flavor, and then malicious, a little iframe, like a 1 pixel by 1 pixel iframe will be inserted on the legitimate site, and that will take you into, ultimately to an exploit server, and you're going to fire up a malicious PDF or malicious Java or whatever inside this 1 by 1 iframe. So that's one example of a drive-by. And then I'm going to take you through a second because it looks like we still have a few minutes. And so this is bulk drive-by, very untargeted, driven off a porn advertising campaign. And for a while, at a couple of different, for like a 48-hour period, I was just seeing event after event after event at a couple of different university sites where there was this same ad for the genital enhancement product, same malicious domains, and then the user getting compromised. And then it all disappeared, and I haven't seen it for the last few days. This next one I'm going to tell you about is a completely different event, and this came across my desk from a customer and was initially thought to be a false negative, but it turned out not to be. But in the process of investigating it, it was sort of interesting. And So the scenario here was, this was a large customer in the energy business. And a couple of employees had received emails that basically said, you know, we have your package and go to this link in order to track it. And I don't have the original email, I didn't get that. But this was the malicious domain, the myapp-ups.net, right? Which, if you're not paying too much attention, it might seem like it had something to do with UPS. And so this, when you went to this domain, and so this particular set of flows that I'm about to show you was not driven off actual user browsing. This was driven off us getting the name of the malicious domain and saying, hey, do you fire on this? And us pointing our product at it and saying, what happens when we point our product at this domain, fire up a virtual machine on it, and we do in fact fire on it. And so the very first thing you get is this, this piece of HTML. And here it is. And this might look a little bit familiar because it's also the black hole exploit kit. You know, and so the front end of this thing, well, you know, it's not driven now off porn ads, it's being driven, I should say the middle of this thing is the same. Instead of being driven off porn ads, here it's being driven off of Spearfish, targeted at a small number of employees at a big corporation, and who are then going to this link and getting a copy of the black hole exploit kit. But what happens afterwards is different. There's a malicious flash here, and then there is this thing, I believe, is the binary. Let me just make sure of that. Yeah, so it all happened in the one flow pretty much. And so this did have a binary in the clear. It's not always done the same way. And this was the sequence of the 4 things that were fetched over this one HTTP flow. And the last one is a binary. And let me see if I can find the actual, it's plain, so we ought to be able to see the header of it. This is the packet. Yeah, right. So you can see this is HTTP response. Here's MZ, the initial sequence for Windows PE headers. This program cannot be run in DOS mode. Okay, so this thing has actually downloaded the binary in the clear. So this is, but as we'll see, this is a different defense against being detected. So this event happened on March 6th. And I investigated it on March 13th, so 7 days later. And so at that time, I uploaded the binary to VirusTotal, this binary. So this is 7 days, roughly, after the event. And that binary was getting 2 out of 43 detects in AV. Okay, so we've got a binary in the clear that's very likely going to get run in AV at a gateway host, but this is not going to get detected because very few AVs are picking up on it, even a week after it actually went by. Right, so the typical scenario with bulk binaries, where it's being driven off a drive-by campaign or advertising campaign or something, is you're throwing this particular MD5 out at a lot of places. It's going to come to the attention of the AV companies fairly quickly, and they're going to write signatures for it if it's not already detected, and it's going to get picked up. And so what you'll see is a scenario where if you upload binaries to Virus, if you watch binaries coming past on the clear and you upload them to VirusTotal right now, you'll find that the effectiveness of AV is around about 25% on a binary that's going past on the wire right this minute. Okay, upload it 24 hours later and it'll be a lot higher. 48 hours high, it'll go up and up again. I last did this in about 2010. I don't have a real recent curve, but basically, the effectiveness of AV goes up dramatically as the binary ages. You know, it's no longer a fresh thing. It's been out for a while. All the AV vendors have seen it. They've written signatures for it. They've QA'd them. They pushed them out. And now this particular binary, this malware binary, is dropping in effectiveness. However, this thing that came through a Spearfish has been out there a week, and it's still only 2 out of 43, right? And so again, this goes back to my point that I was trying to make on this slide here, where we're sort of ranking all the different malwares, and you've got the bulk stuff here that's highly dynamic and is being constantly rotated. But now with the Spearfish thing, you know, we're somewhere out here. This is a low volume threat. These guys were just sending out a handful of Spearfishes at some organization that they were presumably consciously targeting, and then doing the drive-by, and presumably to save effort, they used a common exploit kit. But then the binary is not going to get picked up because it's not going out in bulk. It hasn't come to the attention of AVs. It's still only being detected by 2 out of 43 AVs after a week, you know, and so they don't have to be as dynamic. They can keep using the same binary for a while, and then, you know, eventually, presumably, it starts to come to the attention and get caught, right? But in the meantime, they're under less pressure to keep rotating the stuff because they're not trying to do it in bulk. It's a targeted threat where they're just looking to compromise a few key people, and then once they're in, you know, spread internally, as opposed to, you know, trying to pick up IPs in bulk. And let me just sort of make a few last points on, because the organizers always want us to put in the part about what should you do about all this. And so how do you end up on the far left of my initial curve? How do you end up with 10 infected IPs per week instead of 350? Okay, and I don't have sort of a scientific survey here because we just don't have enough data about everything else our customers do. We have a lot of data off the box, but we don't have data of what the customers do else. So, but what tends to happen is, you know, my title in FireEye is chief scientist, and so I'm sort of heavily involved in new innovation, but I'm also involved in troubleshooting when something's not going right, or particularly if we get into, you know, a large company and we don't find a lot. Why is that? You know, so I often get called to go on site and figure that out. And so this stuff is more coming from my sense of, you know, when we get a low event rate, it turns out there's nothing wrong with the product. It's just a really clean site where there genuinely are only a handful of boxes getting knocked over in a week. What's usually happening is so one great defense is if everything's up to date. Now, it's a rare corporation that's able to do this. But if the desktops are all up to date, in sort of, so far, the most promising way of doing this that I've seen is of EDM infrastructures that, you know, actually get deployed. You know, and you don't have lots of admin users and so forth. You know, most users don't have admin privileges. That certainly helps a lot, right? So there are, it's not that will be 100% guarantee. There certainly are exploits for even the most up-to-date versions of everything. But a lot of exploit kits that are out there have mostly exploits against versions of stuff that's 6 months old or 9 months old. You know, so if you are fully patched, there'll be a lot of threats that will bounce off. Another one is strict proxy policies. The URL blacklists are not able to keep up on malicious domains. So the malicious domains are also being rotated on a, you know, sub-daily cycle in many cases. And so, you know, it comes to the attention of the web sensors and the blue coats and the McAfees of the world that this site is bad, and they start to block it. And then the bad guys say, oh, well, my effectiveness is going down. I'm not getting as many of my exploits succeeding, and so I'm going to get a new domain, right? And now that one's not on the blacklists, right? So that's sort of a Red Queen kind of game where you're constantly running and never never even keeping up. However, a lot of the proxies have the ability to essentially say, if you've never seen the domain before, don't let the user go to it. Okay, that does a lot of good because a lot of malicious domains are new. They've just been registered, in recent weeks, and they're not widely known. Nobody links to them. They're not on the Alexa listing, and they're effective against blacklists because they're brand new and the URL blacklisting company doesn't know about them. But that means if you just don't allow users to go to unknown stuff, then that blocks an awful lot. However, of course, there will be false positives because legitimate sites also pop up and are new and haven't been heard of, but they may well be legitimate and users may have a reason to go to them. And so from time to time you will block them and that, the users will complain. Another good measure is no burr exes. This is on the slide. I think it's increasingly becoming less relevant because the burr exes are sort of not happening as much. It used to be the case that most DXEs were burr on the wire, like we just saw with that spearfishing case I saw you, where you actually see an MZ header in the HTTP response. Mostly now they're inside jars, but still. So a question that I'm not completely up to date on is how much the AV vendors are looking inside the jar. That's certainly something they ought to be doing. It's clear that because Java is, a Turing complete language, that the bad guys can basically obfuscate the exe inside the jar any which way they want. However, they don't always. Sometimes it's just sitting inside the jar, and once you strip off the essentially zip compression, there's your MZ header. So if you don't allow anything, any exes to come in, except if it's coming from Adobe or Microsoft or it's signed by some legitimate software vendor, then that helps. Multiple layers of defense, different AVs. The AVs are none of them are fantastically effective on the current threat on the wire now, but they tend to have different effectiveness. So when you get two of them, the overlap is not that large. They tend to catch different things. Multiple independent layers of email checking. Modern anti-ATP products. So this is us, and we help. Things that could help, but you don't tend to see broadly deployed, are stuff like, that you'll see security professionals doing that's quite effective to stop us from being messed with, is the stuff inside the browser that provides you with a lot of control over whether something's actually going to run or not. Firefox has this no script thing. Chrome has a click to run thing, which will basically make it so that all the flashes and PDFs and whatever show up as a gray box, and you have to deliberately click on them. Right? That makes a tremendous difference because then this one-by-one iframe down here is not going to run, unless you choose to click on that pixel, which is not very likely. And so you sort of, you as the user have a lot more control over saying, I know I came to see this PDF, I know this is a legitimate website, I'm going to look at the PDF, versus weird crap in iframes that who knows what it is, right? And the side benefit is that you don't have to look at all the ads on the websites either because they're all flash and they don't show. However, I have yet to see any large enterprise that had deployed, maybe one of my audience members will be the first, but I've yet to see any large enterprise that has deployed that kind of stuff on a broad scale to the user base. So those are the biggest things that I see that seem to help sites to have relatively few infected machines. But still, it's at the end of the day, it is a bit of a Red Queen game. Nobody's even the highest profile companies do have small rates of infection. Okay, with that, I'm done. Any questions?